I think in terms of networks in the body, and one of the networks that's important when it comes to trauma is the PINE system. Your psychology, your psyche, P. I for your immune system, also your gut, where 70% of the immune system is. And is your neurological system, your brain and the central and peripheral nervous system and enteric nervous system. And then E is your endocrine system. Those are the four systems that are the most vulnerable to trauma and toxic stress. And you can measure the level of dysregulation with each of them.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Stickler. Before we get into this week's episode, I wanted to share with you about a protocol I'm passionate about in my practice. Now, everyone wants to slow down aging, but most of us aren't sure how to do it the right way. And there's something that I recommend that everyone can do, and it takes just 2 days a month. It's a bodily cleanse that helps get rid of old defective cells, these cells we call senescent cells. They're shown to be related to so many symptoms of poor aging. This is something that all of us need to address as we age. This bodily cleanse is a supplement which contains a group of ingredients that we call senolytics. New research on aging and longevity, including a clinical study on qualia senolytic, shows that senolytic supplementation can play a huge role in enhancing how we age. Senolytic ingredients help our body flush senescent cells, supporting repair and rejuvenation from muscles to joints to even how we feel every day. To learn more about senolytic research and to try qualia senolytic risk-free for 100 days, go to qualialife.com/podcast offer and use the code podcast for an additional 15% off.
Hi, and welcome. I'm Lauren Alexander from the Qualia team, and I'm so excited to announce that today we have Dr. Sara Gottfried with us. Dr. Gottfried is a physician, researcher, author, and educator who graduated from Harvard Medical School and MIT and completed residency at UCSF. She is also a global keynote speaker and the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, including her latest book, The Autoimmune Cure. This episode is so packed with insights to help us regulate the body's systems, particularly through personalized approaches like meditation, nutrition, and innovative treatments for trauma. She also highlights her personal experiences treating professional athletes and executives, helping them shift from a path of dysregulation to a fully optimized self. You're going to love this one. Let's dive in.
I'm so delighted at a chance to have you on Collective Insights. This has been a long-awaited interview for all of us on the team. So why don't you just jump in and you tell me about your work and how you got to where you are right now?
Right now, I'm the director of precision medicine at Thomas Jefferson University at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health. So my focus is really the gene-environment interface. And what that means in a practical way is that every patient I see, mostly executives and professional athletes, plus some perimenopausal women, every person I see, I'm doing a genetic blueprint. I'm looking at about 157 single nucleotide polymorphisms. And then I'm looking at their environment, how they interact with their environment. So that includes hundreds of biomarkers that kind of depend on the person. But that can be hormones, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, insulin. It can also be advanced cardiometabolic markers. It can be nutritional markers. So I'm at this place where I really love my work. I've always loved my work, but I'm an entrepreneur and it sort of changes and evolves over time. I'm fortunate to be able to take care of most of the Philadelphia 76ers. And what I think is cool is that a lot of the things that I do with the Philadelphia 76ers, with this NBA team, are things that everyone potentially has access to. So genetic testing, as an example, putting that together with biomarkers, coming up with a dashboard where you can track maybe the 5 to 10 vulnerabilities that you have and how those change over time and how you can optimize them. Because what I learned, you asked kind of how I got here. What I learned 30 years ago at Harvard Medical School is really medicine for the average, population-based, based mostly on randomized trials. And what I learned is that when you're taking care of a person, you don't want to be taking care of the average. You don't want to sort of succumb to the mean. You want to understand that person's goals and then really optimize for what those goals are. So that's the kind of work I do. I also write books. I've got 4 New York Times bestsellers. That's been super fun. My focus right now especially is how we can shift from being dysregulated to being utterly, fully, completely regulated. Whether you're a woman, 40 or older, or you're an NBA player, or you're an entrepreneur who's maybe in his 50s. So regardless of kind of where you start, how do you create the most regulated version of yourself?
Oh, wow. Sign me up, right? I mean, you talked about not prescribing for the averages, right? But at the same time, there's probably some common themes of how to move from dysregulation to regulation that are places to start, or what's your checklist of recommendations to move someone through the process?
It's a good question. I'm a bioengineer by training. That's what I did. I dropped out of a PhD program in bioengineering to go to medical school. And so the way I think of it, because I think of it in terms of modules, to me, the first module is really getting super crisp about what you want for your life. Like, what are your goals? Where are the problems, maybe in your lifestyle? Are you someone who's drinking tequila every night and you need to address that because you've got a sticky relationship to it? Are you someone who is a bit of a stress case, has high cortisol, and that's driving your insulin up and maybe causing belly fat or leading to metabolic dysregulation, which we see in 88% of the Americans right now? So I would say start with an inventory. Start with your history. Find a collaborative health intelligence partner who can really support you with this work. And then second, I would say go to your genetics. Because unless you know what your blueprint is, you're really flying blind. So I think understanding from your family history, understanding what you inherited, we're still in the early stages of understanding the epigenetic components, kind of your soul wounds, what got passed on by your family. But understanding your genetic blueprint, especially with the gene variations or single nucleotide polymorphisms that have been the most studied and the most proven to have a workaround, that's where you begin. And then I would say the biomarkers. And in terms of prioritizing the biomarkers, what I find is that you want to start with nutrition. You want to start with your gut. How are you absorbing and assimilating the foods that you're eating? Are you extracting the B vitamins from the dark leafy vegetables that you're eating? Or are you someone who doesn't do that so well, like me? Are you at a vitamin D level that's going to help you prevent increased intestinal permeability, leaky gut, which is sort of the gateway to inflammation in the body? So knowing what's happening with your nutrition, because so many of us have micronutrient deficiencies, whether it's vitamin D, which is probably the one we know the most about, or magnesium, or the B vitamins, or plant-based antioxidants, or other minerals, glutathione. You want to see where do you have enough and where do you maybe have too much or too little. And this is kind of a principle of functional and precision medicine, that you understand what you have too much of and you back off on those. And you understand what you have too little of and you fill the tank on those. That alone creates a level of regulation that I think is so helpful. So within biomarkers, start with nutrition. Then I would move on to hormones, because hormones drive what we're interested in. And I find especially with cortisol, insulin, and whether you're male or female or gender neutral, we know that estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA are so important. And then you can start to look a little more deeply at cardiometabolic function, especially since that's such a critical driver of not just brain health, but really the way that you age. And it's also cardiometabolic function maps to the top 9 of 10 killers in the United States. So if you're someone who wants to be maybe a prioritizer, go for the 80-20 rule. That's where I'd focus.
Wow. So I want to stop for a minute on number 2 that you talked about, like your genetic history. And I know that, I've listened to a number of interviews you've done for the new book, The Autoimmune Cure, and talking about childhood trauma and just trauma in general having an impact on our health. And also, maybe you could talk about the ACE test. I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, trauma is so critical. And I didn't learn a lot about it in my medical training. So there were two gigantic gaps at Harvard Medical School. And I am so grateful for the education that I got. But there were two huge gaps. One was nutrition and the other was trauma. So what I think about in terms of genetics and how that intersects with trauma is that for some people, they have very little trauma that they've experienced. You know, if you, for instance, do the adverse childhood experiences score, maybe their score is 0 or it's 1. It's not that elevated. But you can also inherit trauma from your ancestors. So maybe it's your great-grandmother who experienced rape or some other trauma. Maybe it's genocide that you had in your family. There are ways that you can still have the signature of trauma in your body, regardless of what you've experienced yourself. Now, that aside, we also know that trauma is more common than not in today's world. So somewhere around 60 to 70% of us have elevated adverse childhood experiences scores. Women fare worse than men. Women have much more sexual trauma. When we're exposed to the same trauma as a man, women develop more post-traumatic stress disorder. They develop more dysregulation. And it's probably because our system in some ways is more sensitive to it. And also the stress response, which I used to think of as fight-flight, that was really defined in men. Women do something different. We do fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And the freezing and the fawning often leads to a stress response that's ongoing, that never completes. And that's what can lead to dysregulation related to trauma. So you can measure these things. You know, a lot of people think of trauma, it's going to affect my mental health. And that's why I've got depression or attention deficit disorder or whatever you're mapping it to. But it's important to realize that trauma also affects you physically and spiritually and emotionally. And so we can measure these things. What I think about is I think in terms of networks in the body, and one of the networks that's important when it comes to trauma is the PINE system. Your psychology, your psyche, P. I for your immune system, also your gut, where 70% of the immune system is. And is your neurological system, your brain and the central and peripheral nervous system and enteric nervous system. And then E is your endocrine system. Those are the 4 systems that are the most vulnerable to trauma and toxic stress. And you can measure the level of dysregulation with each of them.
Wow. How about some stories about your practice, about healing or regulation that you've seen?
My book, The Autoimmune Cure, is full of stories. You know, one of the first stories that I share is a woman named Rada, who's a nutritionist in her 40s. And she just found herself in perimenopause, struggling way more than she ever thought she would. So she ate a healthy diet, which she thought was a healthy diet, but she had endometriosis, she had adenomyosis, she had horrible, painful periods. She also had some metabolic dysregulation that kind of came out of nowhere, and she wasn't sure why it was happening. So she's someone that I worked with on the metabolic pieces first. So we got her to a place of eating food that was the most nourishing for her, and also, by consequence, stabilized her blood sugar. And that made a huge difference. She lost about 42 pounds, mostly fat. But the deeper part here is that she also had significant trauma from childhood, and she was in a marriage that had a lot of abuse and trauma and significant emotional abuse. And it wasn't until she found the courage to leave that relationship, even though that was so scary for her, and she was able to heal and kind of do this bottom-up resolution of the trauma in her body, that she was finally able to feel free of some of these things that were pulling on her and causing so much dysregulation. So that's one of the stories. I mean, it's a woman who now is, I would say, she's at the peak of her career. She has a level of regulation that she's so happy about. She's got a couple of daughters, and she feels like she's able to model that regulation and offer co-regulation to her children, which was hard for her to do when she was still in this marriage. She's divorced. She's got a new partner. So beautiful level of regulation. And she's also setting up her brain. I care a lot about the female brain, the brain in general, but especially the female brain because we're more vulnerable. She's setting up her brain for the best possible future.
Yeah. Wow. That's inspiring. I mean, I think you touched, at least I keep being compelled to ask more questions about this trauma thing because in my journey of interviewing more and more people, it seems like this word about trauma keeps coming up. And the method of releasing trauma is there's so many, people are going to psychedelic retreats, people are going to darkness retreats, neurofeedback. I certainly really responded to neurofeedback personally. And so I'm curious, is there, how do you start? Everyone kind of feels this weight of trauma. Where should we go?
I think the first place to start is to notice whether you're someone who's dissociated. So inventory, know how much trauma you're carrying. You could do the adverse childhood experiences score. You can just Google Sara Gottfried ACE score, and you could do a free test to see what your level is. So I think measuring where you are is really important. Maybe measure your cortisol, look at your insulin and some of the metabolic health markers. What I think is important is that to get started with resolving trauma, know what works and what doesn't work for the population. And then you have to do the N-of-1 experiments to see what's going to work best for you. So when it comes to what works and what doesn't work, the conventional medicine approach, the gold standard, is that you do talk therapy, maybe trauma-informed, maybe not. And what is FDA approved for post-traumatic stress disorder is to take a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And there's 3 that are FDA approved. What I found when I was researching the autoimmune cure is that the efficacy of that approach for PTSD is 30%. So when I started psychotherapy in my 20s, if someone told me, okay, you're going to go once a week, it's going to be a huge time commitment, you're going to go for decades, it's going to take so much time, so much money, and 30% efficacy, I don't think I would have signed up for it, right? But you look at some of these other treatments, you look at something like MDMA-assisted therapy, and the efficacy is somewhere around 67 to 71% at the resolution of PTSD. Now, the patients I take care of don't have PTSD. I take care of mostly people who are very functional, entrepreneurs, and executives, and pro athletes. And so they have what I would call more partial PTSD or subthreshold PTSD. And that's where an N-of-1 experiment can be really helpful. So you mentioned neurofeedback. That helps so many people. Didn't help me with my trauma. I tried EMDR. It helps so many people, but not everyone. Didn't help me. I tried MDMA-assisted therapy. That worked so well, better than anything else I've ever tried. But that's me. That may not be the same for you. So you've got to do that N-of-1 experimentation so that you can really find what's going to be the most effective for you.
Right. And maybe not the talk therapy since that has a low resolution of...
Well, there's benefit to understanding what your experience is. The problem is the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is so good at understanding and making sense of your experience is different than the part of the brain, more in the brainstem, cerebellum, where the trauma signature is lodged. And so there's a way that it's kind of like it's 2 different parts of the brain, and understanding doesn't resolve the trauma. A more bottom-up, somatic-based experience is what seems to be more effective.
Wow. Well, you've given us some practical advice already. But what are just some places you want to land the plane of things you know to be true, some healing advice for our community, and where you want to take us?
For landing the plane, what I really like is to encourage people to come up with a menu, an a la carte menu of what they're going to do when they feel dysregulated. And even to get a sense of what it feels like in your body when you're dysregulated. And then develop a sense of, okay, once you've got your menu items, and I'll get to those in a second, what does it feel to be wholly regulated? Maybe how you feel after the most exquisite orgasm of your life. Like that's the touchstone, the felt sense that I want people to know, because that kind of gnosis of what regulation feels like, that should be what we take forward. Because once you have a sense of dysregulated versus regulated, in some ways there's no going back. It's a one-way door. So what's on the menu? what's on my menu is probably different than what's on your menu. You already mentioned neurofeedback. So I spent, 6 months doing neurofeedback. Didn't seem to make much of a difference for me. But I can tell you that meditating for 30 minutes every morning, that's the right dose for me. I'm someone who had early childhood trauma before age 3. So I have to have a daily practice that allows me to be in a state of calm. And also my mind-body connection is really clear because I'm someone who tends to hang out up here. I go upstairs and I cognitively process the world. I think of it as functional dissociation. So the more that I can create these pathways where I really feel what's going on in my body, the better. So meditation helps me with that.
Well, so I'm a long-time meditator, and there's so many forms and techniques for meditation. Like, what worked for you? What locks you in?
Well, this has changed over time. So I'm someone who started meditating with my great-grandmother when I was 5.
Oh, wow.
So we would go to yoga class, and the whole purpose of yoga, as I was taught it, was that you prepare your body with physical asanas so that you can sit at the end and you can create stillness of the mind. So I tend to focus on breath. That's what I learned initially. When I was 17 and in college, I learned transcendental meditation. So I practiced that for years. I found it really helpful. And then I found I'm someone who's got attention deficit is probably one of my trauma gifts. And I like to vary kind of the structure of my meditation over time. So more recently, what I've been doing is holotropic breath work. So I was deeply immersed in that for about 5 years. And I can get psychedelic experiences with holotropic breath work without taking any medication. More recently, I'm doing something called brailing, which is where you create an immersion practice, takes about 30 minutes, and the last 2 minutes of it, you're connecting to the future and co-creating with spirit what you want in the present moment. So that's a little woo-woo. I am from Northern California. But those are things that work with me, and I appreciate this point that there's so many different ways to do it. This idea that you sit and mindfully notice your thoughts, that doesn't work well for me. Works for some people, it doesn't work for me. Yeah. So in terms of that a la carte menu, can be a lot of different things. So meditation, certainly on there. Maybe separately, mindfulness for some people. It could be orgasm. As I mentioned, I love orgasmic meditation. That's something I did for about 10 years. In its heyday in like 2009 to 2018. I also find that time with girlfriends is such a powerful regulator. You know, there's this old meme that came out of Stanford. A psychiatrist at Stanford wrote an email that got passed around millions of times. If you're a man and you want to improve your health, be with a woman. If you're a woman and you want to improve your health, be with your girlfriends. So there's something about girlfriend medicine that I think is really critical. Women know how to co-regulate, and you can really feel that. So one of the ways we deal well with stress is to tend to befriend, just like you and I are doing right now.
Wow. What a menu. Oh, we're one of those. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.